All right, guys, we're in lesson 9 today. This is Algebra, Saxon Algebra 2, lesson 9. We're talking about percent word problems. We talked a little bit yesterday about percents and our basic formula. Remember our multi-tool formula. So instead of trying to remember just a load of different formulas, we got one formula basic that we're going to work at remembering, and we're going to use that formula, tweak it a little bit when we need to find out, or to be able to find out maybe the percent or the whole or the part. So our basic formula was this: if you remember, part equals percent times the whole. And then we could use basic algebra to turn it into this formula: percent equals part divided by the whole. How do we do that? Well, we just divided by W on both sides and got percent by itself. We do the same thing for whole. If we're looking for the whole, we can divide by percent on both sides to get W, or whole, by itself. And so this particular formula is the one we're going to use in order to solve what we're solving today. And hopefully we'll get through this pretty quickly. So let's look at example 9.1. Example 9.1 says the wood nymphs and the maids gambled and frolicked before the banquet began. A little gambling and frolicking before the banquet. If 70% of those present were wood nymphs and 120 maids were present, how many wood nymphs came to the banquet? I told you yesterday, this is how I like to write those out. I got one bubble representing the whole, the number how many were total there. Then I have another bubble over here. That's really just a basic breakdown of this bubble. It tells us the parts, the different parts, and the different percentages. Now there's some things that we don't know. And what we don't know is the whole, and we don't know the parts. Now the 120 is the maids, and this lower part here is going to be the nymphs. So we don't know how many nymphs there were, and that's what we're looking for. They're wanting us to find out how many nymphs there were. But in order to find out how many nymphs there are, we're going to have to first find out how many total there were. So let's get started right away. What are we going to do? How are we going to solve this? What are we going to solve for? Now we're going to use one of our 3 different formulas to solve, but how are we going to do that? Well, to start off with, we've got to find, like we mentioned, the whole. And if we've got to find the whole, we're just going to come over here and remember our part equals percent times the whole. We could remember these, but remember we're working on just having that one multi-tool. And then we're going to decide, how do we make this work for us right now? Well, let's solve for W. Divide by percent here, divide by percent here. Those percents cancel, and I'm left with the formula W equals, or whole equals, part divided by the percent. So let's work on that real quick. Part divided by percent. Which one, or what do we know where we have both part and percent? We can't use the nymphs because we don't know the part. We can use this one because we know the part, we know the percent. So part divided by percent is going to be 120 divided by 30%. Now, recall that when we're working in mathematics, we can't divide by a percent. We have to change that into a decimal. And so we're actually going to divide by 0.3 there. And so when we divide 120 by 0.3, what happens? We're going to get a total. We're not going to go through all the calculations here, but you can do this on your own. But we get a total then of 400, dividing 0.30 into 120. So how do we do that? Well, again, just to show, if we had 0.30 dividing into 120, remember our divisor can't have a decimal in it. We're going to move it over 2 spaces. That means we have to move this over 2 spaces. And so effectively it's 30 into 12,000. How many times does 30 go into 12,000? Goes in there 400 times. That's solving for W, that's solving for whole. So the whole is 400. So how do I figure out how many wood nymphs there are? Well, that's the easy part. We're just going to have 400, we're going to subtract 120 because there were 120 maids. And what does that leave us with? Yeah, 280. So there are 280 wood nymphs. That's a pretty simple process. And so that's all there is to this basic percent word problem. Then we go to the next one, 9.2. 9.2 is just a little different, but we're still going to use the same basic process. Now let's look at how it's worded. The harvest was cornucopian. If you know what a cornucopia is, it's that thing you see at Thanksgiving, and Brother Chad's a horrible drawer, but it's got this horn, and it's kind of hollowed out right here, and it's got all kinds of fruits just pouring out of it. That's a cornucopia, and it represents bounty. It represents a lot of good things, and it says that our harvest was really, really good. That's what they're saying. Harvest was really good. It was cornucopian compared to last year. Matter of fact, it was 120% greater than last year. And it says it was so good that this year's bounty was 140,800 bushels. What was last year's bounty is what it's asking. Now, it says this year's was 120% greater than last year's. And so what is my percent going to be? Did you say 120%? That's a typical answer. If you did, that's not right. Because that's not what the book says. The book says it's 120% greater. Well, how do we justify that? Well, whatever last year's, let's just say this was last year's amount. Last year. Whatever they did last year, we're going to do 120% greater for this year. Now, how much percent of last year's did they have? Because that's a trick question. Last year was just 100% of last year. And so this year was 120% greater than last year. So to figure out our percent, we'd have to have 100 from last year plus 120% from this year. And so this year's percent is 220%. And so now we're going to go through the same basic process. Solving for W, we can remember use our multi-tool. Percent equals part divided by the whole, or part equals percent times the whole. Let's go ahead and divide by percent on both sides to get our formula for whole, part divided by the percent. What is our part? Our part is 140,800. Now we're going to divide that by 220%. Now again, recall that we can't use a percent when we're doing our math or doing math calculations. We have to make that into a decimal. So that means we're going to divide by 100, put that decimal point right there. We could go ahead and do the calculations out. We can show you how that works again. We would just be taking that 2.20 into 140,800. We'd have to move this over whenever we did that, which means move the decimal point over there. So what happens whenever we take 220 into that big number, we're going to get a much smaller number than we had here initially. And so that smaller number after we did that is going to equal 64,000 bushels. And so our whole is going to be 64,000. Now look at it, and so if we're looking at this, you're thinking it doesn't make sense because the whole is much smaller than the part. How is the whole smaller than the part? I know it doesn't make sense, but remember our initial percentage was much higher. Matter of fact, much higher, above 100%, which means our part is going to be above or higher than our whole. And so hopefully this will just remind us a little bit about those percent word problems. Just don't forget, use that multi-tool. Part equals percent times the whole, and then make it work for you. Whatever you need, it often helps to draw out these diagrams. I know your book has some square diagrams. I like the oval diagrams, and I can break the percentages up just like this. Notice the 30%, 70% gives me a total of 100%. I think if you work them out like this, it'll help you. Don't be ashamed or don't be scared to try to draw things out, even on your work papers that you have to keep in your binder or turn in, or on your quizzes or your tests. These will help you. And as always, if you have any questions, let me know. I'll do my best to answer those.